another reason why we should be in the sunshine is that sunlight not just synthesizes vitamin D, it stimulates the breakdown of vitamin A into the retinoids, into the retinoic acids.
I gotta get myself a little more faith, a little more love.
I'm your host, Christa Bigler, and I'm going to guess we have at least one thing in common, that we're both in pursuit of a less stressed life. On this show, I'll be interviewing experts and sharing clinical pearls from my years of practice to support high-performing, health-savvy women in pursuit of abundance and a less stressed life. One of my beliefs is that we always have options for getting the results we want, so let's see what's out there together. Today on The Less Stress Life, I have Morley Robbins, previously widely, maybe still majorly known as the Magnesium Man. I don't know if that we're still using that one anymore, but is really the creator of Root Cause Protocol and the founder, maybe the initial claim to fame was really that founder of the Magnesium Advocacy Group. He has a degree in biology from Denison University and an MBA in healthcare administration from George Washington. He transitioned from a 32-year career in hospital administration to focus on natural healing after a personal health crisis. He's conducted over 7,500 consultations worldwide, emphasizing the critical roles of magnesium, copper, and iron in health, and his work aims to address chronic fatigue and disease by correcting mineral imbalances and oxidative stress through the Root Cause Protocol. Welcome to the show, Morley.
Thank you. Great to be here. Look forward to our discussion.
Yeah, I was telling him this morning, I was first introduced to the Root Cause Protocol about 5 years ago, and as probably like most, it was like eye-opening from the person I was getting the secondhand information from, or just parts of it, talking about vitamin A. I believe our conversation was a nerdy conversation about vitamin A. And what I really appreciated, what I can really get behind 100%, is I had done a lot of comprehensive micronutrient testing for a long time, and it was fun for a while, and we got some good results, but I was really getting disillusioned by the lack of synergy over time. And I really wanted less is more with supplements. And so that's why I've warmly wrapped my arms around concepts that Morley has shared because of synergistic. This is what I wanted. I was sick of seeing people on so many supplements. And then the worst thing ever was if they would come back to me years later on the same things. I was like, oh my gosh, why are you still on this thing? And so I was looking for a solution to this woe of mine. And so I even talk about this a lot now, is just that I really am looking at a nutrient synergy. And so that's, I think, that's maybe not where things started for Morley, but I think that's a really good hat to hang on, in my opinion, is food-based synergistic nutrition is how I got introduced and appreciate his work. So I'm wondering, today we have a topic. We'll see how many tangents. You and I are both, I think, tangent people, so buckle up, everyone. But today we are tasked with talking through a topic that I think has been maybe too long coming here, which is let's not look at vitamin D too surface level. Let's unpack it a little bit more. But before we go there, I always ask people a little bit about their story of like, why did you leave the incredible life of 32 years of healthcare administration? What was happening in life? Like, where did some of this start for you? And then I'd like to ask us a little bit about Root Cause Protocol before we get into some of our content for today. But where did it all start for you?
As I mentioned in our reading warm-up, I grew up in a very sickly family. My sister became a nurse. I was supposed to become a doctor until I got to college. It's a lot of work. Didn't get into medical school, thank God. That would have been a disaster. And if you don't go to medical school, you really want to stay in the health field, you go into administration. So I went to business school and was pretty good at it. Never was in charge of the hospital per se. Was never the CEO, but I was always reporting to the CEO, focusing on growth, business development, marketing, things of that nature, planning. And I was pretty good at helping organizations grow and did the formal work in hospitals and hospital systems for 12 years. And then for 20 years was a consultant, solving problems all over the country. And when you're a consultant, you're on a plane most of your life. And so I was dragging a suitcase behind my back for the bulk of those 20 years, and developed what's called frozen shoulder. Couldn't pick my hand up above my waist. And went to a health food store to see what they could do. They said, you need to go see Dr. Liz. And I put my hands up and said, look, I don't do witchcraft, because I knew that I'm a chiropractor. So what kind of supplements do you have? They sold me supplements. It didn't work. I went back a couple months later, and the owner, Lynn Bednar, was there that day. And she looked me in the eye. She said, Morley, we love you. Go see Dr. Liz. So my tail between my legs, I went to see Dr. Liz, who is now my wife, I might add.
Oh,
It was a life-changing experience. And the way she solved my frozen shoulder is by going on the inside of my mouth to the pterygoid muscle and put the full weight of her body on that joint and that muscle. And as the pressure that she was producing matched the tension in that muscle, my arm went up. It was a miracle. And I was like very impressed. And we were talking about that process. And she used a phrase I'd never heard in 32 years of working in hospitals. She talked about the innate healer. I'd never heard that phrase. And without saying anything to her, I said to myself, if there's an innate healer, why do we have millions of doctors around the world? So I pledged that I was going to find out who is the innate healer. And after many years, a dozen or more years of research, that's what led to the book, Cure Your Fatigue, because it's all about copper. Copper is an innate healer. And that's a very provocative and controversial concept, as I'm sure we'll uncover during the course of our conversations. But there's compelling evidence to that. And one thing led to another, and I decided to just leave the healthcare field. And I became Dr. Liz's Girl Friday. I was checking people in and out. And I said, would you mind if I do research? So as long as you check people in and out. And I wholesale change in my life and started doing massive research about minerals. And part of what really sparked it, well, we took it pretty seriously. And we were working with a form of magnesium that was causing diarrhea. And I was troubled by that. And so I got out to find a company that had a magnesium product that didn't cause diarrhea. And they had it the day that I called Jigsaw was the day that Patrick Sullivan Jr. answered the phone. It was his turn. And what should have been a 10-minute conversation turned into over an hour conversation. And that's when the friendship began and the relationship. And that's eventually what led to Magnesium. The stipulation was, you don't have to talk about Jigsaw, just talk about magnesium. And so I did. I just talked about magnesium. It was a lot of fun. It was very carefree. It was very innocent back in 2010, 2011, 2013.
we're making so many enemies. Everyone was a fan of magnesium.
No, and what's really funny about
It's bipartisan conversation.
it's local. But I remember having a conversation with a colleague at a conference, and he was basically taking me to task. And he said, Morley, if it was that simple, if it was just magnesium, we would have figured it out. And in my arrogance, hubris, I said, well, you don't understand it the way I do. He was right. I was wrong. And over a period of 5 years, I realized, I want to find out why is there losing magnesium. It's a really good thing to know, right? Well, it turns out it's from oxidative stress. Well, where does the oxidative stress come from? If iron is building in the body, it interacts with oxygen in the body, and that creates the oxidative stress. Then I had to figure out, why is iron building in the body? Why is oxygen not being managed properly? And that's what got me to copper. And that process of going from magnesium deficiency to, it's copper, that was a 5-year period to piece together the puzzle. And as I got to copper and then realized that it's the best kept secret on the planet. It's been suppressed for over 100 years. And I'm just amazed at what people don't know about copper. Everyone is convinced it's toxic. The meme that runs medicine, by the way, is you're anemic and you're copper toxic. And if you believe that, I've got a used BMW outside I'd love to sell you. And it's the exact opposite. That's the inversion of the truth. We are drowning in iron in our tissue. It's not showing up in the blood. There's a reason why it's not showing up in the blood, because we don't have enough copper to regulate its release. And so I have uncovered a lot of nuances to human physiology that's not taught in medical school. And the real tragedy is I don't think doctors know how energy is made. I don't think they know how blood is made. They don't know how bone is made. And they don't know how babies are made. And it's really staggering because all four of them require bioavailable copper. So it's just a foundational mechanism that no one is taught. It doesn't matter what faith or persuasion of medicine you're in. There's complete ignorance about copper metabolism, the regulation of oxygen, the regulation of iron. And it's a glaring gap in clinical understanding of blood.
We got to go back to a few things. First of all, it's a good thing that someone loved you enough to say, go back to doctor. And I was thinking, I think you like to make jokes on the side. So I was thinking behind every successful man is a really incredible woman. And so I need to wrap a little bit of a bow because that magnesium man thing was a lot of an identity. I actually didn't know that your relationship with Jigsaw started then. I just talked to Patrick a little bit here and there about how you guys end up in 2-hour-long conversations every once in a while, weekly. And so I didn't know that went that far back, but I have to close the loop. People are going to want to know about the magnesium that was causing diarrhea. And we've talked about this before. Patrick and I have done magnesium talks, but hey, let's just cover what forms of magnesium you switched to at that time. Maybe you don't care anymore because you've moved on to copper. And I agree. The more we learn, the more we realize we don't know, but let's finish the magnesium form comment, and then I've got some more things.
The form of magnesium, really what happened was Patrick said, I'll do a Pepsi challenge. I'll take our product and go up against anybody. So we did. But the two forms of magnesium I think are superior are magnesium malate, which is the backbone of the Jigsaw product, great product, and magnesium glycinate.
Okay.
I'm going to avoid naming the specific product, but the most popular form of magnesium is not what people think it is. And
citrate.
People don't know that citrate is an endogenous inhibitor of the ceruloplasmin protein. See, most people don't know what ceruloplasmin is. The book talks about 3 minerals and a protein. The protein is ceruloplasmin. And it's one of the biggest proteins in the body, 1,046 amino acids. Put it in perspective, insulin is 42. And it has 8 coppers inside it. Okay, so it's really a tank. There's actually 5 soldiers in the tank. This has 8 soldiers. And the question that no one's asking about copper toxicity, high copper in the hair or high copper in the blood, is what chemical was the person exposed to that denatured the ceruloplasmin that caused the tyrosine trapdoor to open and the copper to leak out like diarrhea? That's the question that no one's asking. There's things like ascorbic acid, birth control pills, high fructose corn syrup, 4th generation antibiotics, and when it goes, that blow up ceruloplasmin to cause copper to come out. And maybe that's the problem. Maybe it isn't the copper. Maybe it's the drugs that we're being exposed to in our diet, in our medical routines, and people aren't aware of that.
Yeah.
To me, that's the greatest sin.
I know. And I know you want to talk about copper. And I should have asked you before we got here, what are you most excited about? You're obviously most excited about copper. And I want to have a copper conversation, and I want to come ready to play to the copper conversation.
Let's go back to where you want to go.
Yeah, let's start. We'll come back to copper. Let's start with the thing that when people walk in to see me, I am educating them about, which is vitamin D. And I don't think that vitamin D is evil as much as misunderstood. But what I want to, and this is where my relationship with you indirectly started, which is that when we are on high dose vitamin D, it's creating other antagonistic things happening in the body. And we need to back up to a big picture conversation in order to do this topic justice, to do a good job with it. And so the reality is that there's over 100,000 articles on PubMed related to vitamin D. I need to set the stage here, right? There's over 100,000 articles on vitamin D on PubMed, and it covers everything from bone health to immune function, cardiovascular, mental health, COVID-19, especially really popular, right? What was really popular that we saw in the last 5 years is people coming in on high dose D and zinc, and zinc creating problems for copper as well. And there's a conversation around it. There's a lot to say about vitamin D. And I think this is how you've landed, is that it shows correlation, but not causation. And so I want to unpack a little bit of where, if we can get to the 101 of, we could talk about vitamin D. I don't know that we need to talk, whatever you want to talk about with vitamin D metabolism, but maybe what we need to point out is what is the issue in the world. And I think this is actually an issue that it crosses multiple topics, which is synthetic, perhaps. And that might be like this step one, is where we look at vitamin D and there appears to be issues. And so our solution is synthetic. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. This is how I describe it, is that we're over simpletons sometimes, right? It's like, we saw low iron in the blood, so we gave iron. We saw low vitamin D, so we gave D. And have I ever seen benefits short term from this? Yes. And also, it's a fat soluble nutrient that's got these other pieces. And so that's what I want to make sure we start with today, because I think when we lose that component, that we're missing in general. So let's talk about what is the issue when everyone's, duh, vitamin D is great because look at all this research. What's the issue right there? And then how have we misused vitamin D going forward from there?
So I think I've been heavily influenced by Mark Twain. When you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to switch sides. So I think people need to really take a step back and say, oh, okay, maybe I should be a little more balanced. Maybe there's more to the story. Let's just leave it at that. There's more to the story. There's 4 fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K. 2 are MIA in the diet. Vitamin A, vitamin E, nowhere in the diet. D and K have been weaponized. And so that's a very different way of thinking about it. But it isn't that I'm against vitamin D. We absolutely need to have vitamin D. We need to get it in our food, especially if you can't get it in by going outside in the sunshine, which is the purest form. And it's the water-soluble form, according to Stephanie Sano, because the sunshine makes sure that the molecule gets sulfated, and then it becomes water-soluble, and it's not fat-soluble. It's a big change in the properties of that nutrient to get from fat to water. But it's about balance. And in nature, vitamin D is very often, almost always paired with vitamin A, especially like in cod liver oil. The cod liver oil that Jigsaw sells is 20A to 1D. A lot of cod liver oils are 10 to 1. Historically, it was been 10 to 1 because it's Atlantic cod, and what Jigsaw is using is Alaskan cod. And for some reason, the Alaskan species has a much higher concentration of retinol. That's great. But our ancestors were graced with a lot of outdoor activity. They didn't stay indoors like we do, working on computers or whatever the excuse is for not being outside. But I think we also have to understand that historically, these nutrients weren't always here. And it turns out that vitamin A came onto the planet 700 million years before vitamin D. Well, okay, that's interesting. So what is vitamin A? Oh, it's a light sensor. We got light. What are we going to do with that light? We got light. Come on, let's use that light. And then 709 years later, along comes a light filter. Vitamin D is sunglasses. And it's always attached to sunlight, wink, wink. But the sun, whenever you see the sun in an article about vitamin D, it's wearing sunglasses. Ding, ding, code. And people don't know what that means. And so it was actually Weston A. Price who figured this out. He was a brilliant dentist at the turn of the century, or the last turn of the century. But he noted that there was a significant rise and fall of vitamin D levels according to what the season was. And when there is more sunshine, there's more red light. And when there is more red light, there is less vitamin D in the person's body. And test the opposite with winter. Winter has less light. It's more blue light, but the vitamin D tends to be higher. And so the confusion is, what is that storage D really doing? What's fluctuating with the sunlight? And while it has a relationship with the immune system, which I'm intimately familiar with, there's a difference in the immune system between suppression and downregulation. So when someone is sleeping, suppression is putting a pillow over their head and cutting off their air supply. That's suppression. Downregulation is singing a lullaby. Vitamin D suppresses the immune system, which it did during COVID. Vitamin A downregulates it. Again, they're vastly different philosophical and physiological concepts. And my personal opinion is we need both, but we have been corralled, bullied, propagandized that vitamin D is the answer to every problem you have. And that's just not true. And so they bent over backwards to correlate low vitamin D to every conceivable condition on the planet. And that's not a causal connection, it's a correlational connection. And here's the part that everyone has missed. So there's two forms of vitamin D. There's storage and active, right? And actually, if you really want to get into the weeds of it, and I don't know whether you follow the work of Jim Stevenson Jr., who's a electrical engineer whose former wife almost died of vitamin D overdose. And so he took it upon himself to learn vitamin D metabolism. There's no one on the planet that knows vitamin D better than Jim Stevenson Jr., including Dr. Hollick up at Boston University. And there are about 20 different metabolites of vitamin D. But all we ever hear about is 25-hydroxy, storage D. Very rarely do we ever hear about active D, 125-hydroxy, and certainly not 24-25-hydroxy. It just goes on and on. There are countless derivatives of this metabolite that no one knows about. But the point is, the storage D is made in the liver.
Yeah, this is what I want to cover, is that this is our understanding of vitamin D via sunlight. And I have some questions about one of the comments you made related to Dr. Price saying that the vitamin D was lower in the summer. But let's talk about via the sun.
I made a mistake. It's just the opposite. It's going to be higher in the summer and lower in the winter because it's blocking the light during the summer. And it's because you have less light in the winter, there needs to be more release of the light into the body. So the D is going to go down. So I got that. Awesome.
Okay, that would make sense.
I apologize.
No, that's okay. I just want to start with basic vitamin D metabolism because I actually used to, this was something that was really bothering me. I'll just tell you a little bit of a story. When I was working in dialysis, as you may know, nutrition is a big deal in dialysis. If you eat too much potassium in dialysis, you're going to have a heart attack because your kidneys filter it out. Other people, fine. Dialysis, kidneys don't work, not okay. So
Right.
there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens. It's a very highly medical intervention situation. Lots of feelings about that. But the reason I was interested in vitamin D at that time was because I'd have these patients that were on 50,000 milligrams of vitamin D2. And I was asking my nephrologist that I worked with,
IUs. Milligrams or IUs?
IUs. Yeah.
Okay.
50,000 IUs once a week of vitamin D2. But here's the reason this matters. D is supposed to be made when you have exposure to the sunlight, but it's got to go through the liver, and then the last step is the kidneys to get made into the version that your body is using. And the last step is the kidneys. If you look up a picture of basic vitamin D metabolism, you'll see an image. And so the last step, if you're not going to convert D2 to D3 via the kidneys, I was dumbfounded on why. I was like, Dr. Raymond, why are these people on this? And he said, because the doctors at the hospital don't know what they're doing, but then no one takes them off of it. And so they're actually put on multiple forms and types. I only tell you that story because it's really an anchor in my brain of memory of how vitamin D sort of works. And so before we go past this sunshine component too much, have some curiosities. And then I want to get into the cofactors and how it interplays with vitamin A and how this conversation may become about vitamin A shortly, more so than vitamin D. But when we're thinking about this, an experiment that I haven't gotten to run that I was just curious about, so I'm curious if you have any experience with this, is that I've always wanted to play with, because when you start to talk about sunlight, and I live in the northern part of the United States, and fortunately I'm coming into more sunlight during this conversation, but as you're also, I guess, on the upper part of the hemisphere, we don't always have a lot of sunlight sometimes. And so the conversation becomes for people, how does it work to use other alternatives to sunlight, right? There's vitamin D lamps, and do they actually work? And you probably don't care at all about this. These are just still questions I ask myself, but I didn't want to go past how we're creating vitamin D. And I know that the part of the conversation that we're trying to have is that the issue is that we are then supplementing a bunch of D without really considering the cofactors. To me, that's the big part of the conversation. But anyway, any comment on when there isn't, and maybe this goes back to innate wisdom of the body where it's, not everywhere has sun all the time. And here's how the body, and I think you were trying to describe this earlier, but I got a little confused with it. And so I'm just wondering, does innate wisdom include meaning that our body is supporting us no matter what, even in these dark months? And then the other part is also, I think part of the conversation is the issue that we're not outside, of course, but it's what if there's no sun actually?
No, as I understand it, the liver can store 6 months of vitamin D. We've been led to believe that suddenly, when it goes in the winter, you're screwed. No, and what did our ancestors do? They relied on their diet for their sources of nutrients.
By consuming liver. By consuming liver.
Incomparable, and consuming grass-fed products. People don't understand what the significance of grass and sunshine are as it relates to building nutrients. And we live in I remember when I first started my work, I was accosted by people who said, I'm dairy-free, sugar-free, corn-free, and they were wheat-free. And I was picturing a plate with ice on it. What are you eating? What's your source of nutrients? And so the concept that we have to be at the equator for half the day, stark naked, is just not true. The actual production is stimulated by sunlight in the eye. It isn't this massive body that has to be exposed to sunlight. And the part that isn't understood is B9 is very important for stimulating the process to make vitamin D. It's a little B9.
B9.
Folate.
Yes.
Well, folate.
I wanted to make sure we heard you because it was hard to hear. B9 was essential.
B9. But the flip side is that B9 is involved in the breakdown of vitamin A. The part that everyone's missing is that another reason why we should be in the sunshine is that sunlight not just synthesizes vitamin D, it stimulates the breakdown of vitamin A into the retinoids, into the retinoic acids. There's 4 of them. They're very powerful hormones. I would say they're far more powerful than hormone D. And the other thing that it creates is the nuclear receptors, our ARs, our ORs, our XRs, our YRs, our ZRs. Nobody knows about those. And why is everyone's thyroid off? Because they don't have enough retinol in their diet to generate the RXR receptor that needs to be married up to the thyroxine receptor to stimulate the promoter region in the gene to make T4. So there's so much misinformation and misunderstanding about why certain metabolites are low. But the thing is, here's the part that only one scientist has ever brought to my attention. His name was Leslie Clevet. He's an MD, PhD. He's a cardiologist and a copper expert. And in my first, actually it wasn't my first, it was actually my second conversation with, I had many, but I remember the order. But in the second conversation, I proposed to him that, I said, Dr. Clevet, I have this theory that all of the B vitamins are copper dependent and they regulate iron metabolism. He said, Morley, I can't comment on all the B vitamins. He said, it's a very interesting theory. He said, but what I can tell you for a fact is that B9 is copper dependent. Did you know that B9 was copper dependent? Most people don't know. Oh, and just
But a lot of things are copper dependent, and we're not really talking about copper, so that's okay, right? It's like we don't think about that. We don't think about it like this.
In past winters, my son has gotten dry hands that can crack and bleed. I found that giving him at least 300 to 600 milligrams of high-quality fish oil really resolves this in a few weeks. This year, I started him on Jigsaw's Alaska cod liver oil because it's the best value for high-quality U.S.-sourced cod liver oil. Just 1 teaspoon gives him 1,000 milligrams of total omega-3s, which just means faster results with nature's natural dose of synergistic vitamin A and D already found in cod liver oil to support immune health. Jigsaw sources their cod liver oil from Alaska, where line-caught fish are flash frozen on the boat. This keeps the fish oil very fresh, so it doesn't require more processing and deodorizing like other fish oils, which can disrupt the oils and nutrients. So when you combine Jigsaw's incredible cod liver oil with some of their other wonderful electrolyte mineral products, it's a winning combination to keep your skin beautifully hydrated year after year. You can get a discount on all of Jigsaw's products, including Alaska cod liver oil, Electrolyte Supreme, Adrenal Cocktail, and Potassium Cocktail, formerly known as Pickleball, at jigsawhealth.com with the code LessStressed10, which you can use on each and every order. That's code LessStressed10.
No, but the thing is, you can't make vitamin D and you can't stimulate the breakdown of vitamin A without it. And it's central to the physiology. And the key is in the liver where we're making vitamin D, the enzyme, the 25-hydroxylase enzyme, is magnesium dependent. Documented. And many of there's 8 places in vitamin D metabolism that are magnesium dependent. So it's a very important metabolite for vitamin D. And here's the catch. The standard Western diet is very low in minerals, as you probably know. Most of all, low in copper. And when copper is low in the diet, iron rises in the liver. That was first documented at the University of Wisconsin, 1928, in March of 1928, and at the University of Kentucky in May of 1928. So a low copper diet in an animal causes high iron in the liver. But when the iron is rising in the liver, it's creating oxidative stress. Axiomatic, it's just how the body works. What burns up magnesium? Oxidative stress. And so this perpetual state of low vitamin D is born from low copper, high iron that's affecting the 25-hydroxylase enzyme in the liver and then goes on to affect 125 hydroxylase in the kidney. And what's causing the kidney disease? Oh, it's an accumulation of iron in the tubules, well documented. And I think probably one of the most important articles I've read about vitamin D is by Mangin, M-A-N-G-I-N, 2014, on vitamin D and inflammation. And it took me 3 weeks to read that article when we first read it, because there's a significant proportion of extrarenal active D that's made by macrophages that's not made in the kidney, but it uses the same mechanism. And people don't.
That does not surprise me.
Yeah.
The body's pretty cool like that. It will do what it needs to do.
Absolutely. But here's the part that's, I think, really important about that, is that everyone focuses on storage D. Very few, if ever, does a practitioner test for active D. I'm originally from Baltimore. My nickname is Baltimorley, and I worship at the altar of Johns Hopkins. There's some pretty smart people there. And Mohammed Amer in 2013, I know long time before COVID, but he did an all-cause mortality study about storage D. And what he found was there's no clinical benefit to having storage D above 21. That's heretical in the glycoholic fraternity. Oh, it's got to be somewhere between 70 and 100. And what Dr. Amer said was, no, there's no benefit. And there's also a marker for active D, and it really shouldn't go above 45. So the ratio of active to storage D should be about 2-1. Now, a fun biomarker for you to play with in your practice is to start measuring active D along with your storage D.
Yeah, I want to highlight what those are called, if you don't mind, for everybody. It's a little confusing, and I appreciate you calling it storage versus active because I think it's easier. And I wish that we called it that all the time because it's easier, because these things will run together. Storage form being 25 hydroxy D, active.
Yes.
Sometimes you really don't call it this, calcidiol, and then active form being 125 hydroxy, possibly called calcitriol. So basically, we're always measuring, just to reiterate, we're always measuring storage, 25 hydroxy, but we should also measure active, which is 125. So it's 1,25 hydroxy. What's confusing maybe when you're reading it, usually I don't remember if it usually says hydroxy, but it will usually have a parentheses behind the 25 as OH, which means hydroxy in this scenario. So it's confusing the way you read it. And that's what makes, I think in general, we get confused with nutrients because there's nuance, lots of nuance.
It's a sin to call them vitamins. They are hormones, steroid hormones. And as I understand it, the hormone D is the only hormone where you don't measure both active and storage level. All the other hormones, you always, and the argument is, oh, it's so volatile, we can't keep track of it. It's like, all the active hormones are volatile. What are you talking about? Why are you parsing this with vitamin D? And the part that's really important for people to know is if they're active to storage is rising above the 2-1 ratio. And this is all written up in Meg Mangan's article, wonderful article. The active D is being converted to an antimicrobial peptide.
Interesting. Why?
Because iron is building in the tissue and the pathogens are drawn to that iron. And again, this is particularly true of the extra-renal active D being produced by the macrophages. Because what are they're the Pac-Man, trying to clean up the debris, trying to clean out the tissue. And so this is a really important component that people don't know about. And so I think that gap in our understanding about active versus storage is significant. I think not knowing that there's an extra-renal source of active, that's significant. It was Tom Ferris, who is a professor of medicine at Yale Medical School, published an article in 1962. I don't know. I think Yale's a pretty good school. He probably knows what he's talking about. But he talked about vitamin D supplementation causing renal potassium wasting. And what I noted very early on in the work that I did with hair tissue neuroanalysis was that people who are into vitamin D had very low potassiums on a hair test, strikingly low. And I don't know whether you know the nuance of a fast versus a slow oxidizer, but a fast oxidizer needs sodium and potassium to run their system. And when they take vitamin D, that potassium crashes, which brings down the sodium, and then you've got a real problem on your hand because metabolically they can't support that low sodium and potassium. And so people don't know about that nuance. They don't know about Tom Ferris's research from 1962. That's ancient history, right? We're not supposed to know about that. So old, and yet wisdom doesn't go away.
Yeah, old research is totally fine when we're talking about nutrient physiology. That doesn't change. Well, our understanding of it changes, but when we're trying to unpack the actual physiology, that should be a forever thing because it was always there.
But the other real big watershed event for me was my strategy as I've done this work, done this research. If I find an article that really speaks to me, really seems to have integrity, I'll track down the author's phone number and call them to thank them. And so this was back in 2010. I'm still living in Chicago, where there's no sunshine, but I'm not worried about it. And I came across this article about cholesterol written by lipidologist Fred Kummerow, who is at the University of Illinois, in downstate Illinois, at the Champaign-Urbana. I called him up and I told him what I really enjoyed about the article. He said, would you like to come down and have lunch with me? I said, sure, I'd love that. I didn't know it at the time. He was 98 years old. And he was still working 20 hours a week at his lab. This guy was ever ready bunny. And got to his home and we had grass-fed hamburgers, homegrown tomatoes. He loved chocolate milk and had a wonderful meal together. And then he started to share with me his research that he did in the 1970s for a decade using pigs, which are identical to humans. Well, we know some people who are pigs, right?
I was waiting for this. Pigs identical to humans. Okay.
But they respond exactly the same to vitamin D supplementation that humans do. And at the end of his research, he was invited to an international symposium on vitamin D supplementation. Well, he's one of the keynote speakers. There's Nobel laureates at this meeting. I mean, you probably don't know the name Fred Kummerow, but it's a really big deal in the world of lipid research. And he gets up and he says, ladies and gentlemen, you do not supplement with vitamin D. Well, they went crazy. And I said, Dr. Kummerow, what happened as a result of that talk? Well, you got to picture, he was 6'2". I'm 6 feet. He's a big guy. And he gets this glint in his eye. And he's 98 years old, but he's got so much energy. I was just so impressed. He leans in and he says, well, Morley, I'm the only one who's still standing. All the others are dead. And then he proceeds we go to his lab and he proceeds to give me a stack of research to back up what he was saying. And so I took it upon myself to, I guess, augment my understanding of vitamin D. And it's a very complicated subject. It's a very popular subject. There's a webinar that we have on the root cause protocol. I think it's a 90-minute webinar that people can download. I mean, it's behind a paywall. Sorry, a lot of good information there. But it's full of research that should make people question, should I be doing this in isolation of other nutrients, especially vitamin A. And
K2.
The thing with K2 is that's tricky as well, because I have a client in Germany who went full bore into K2 and he messed up his copper as a result of it.
I could
And you would-
understand that. I don't think you should just, your body should technically make K2. K2
Exactly.
is made from good bacteria and K1. Not everyone has good bacteria, and that can compromise what's happening with calcium. And I have seen massive improvements in calcium from just doing a little bit of K2 for a little while and then not. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of things are Goldilocks, right?
Yes, that's right.
That's the bottom
Absolutely.
line. It's like you can't just do one thing forever. You can do food-based nutrients forever. That's okay.
Yeah.
You can do
Yeah,
food-based supplements. I think you can do cod liver. I don't think you should just be on supplement. I'm getting a little philosophical, but aren't we all? Or just in general, I would rather not be on supplements, and I would like to be able to use them if I need them, if I want them or need them for something, if that's what I want. But anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I think we're very close in alignment. The thing is, the food system is very different today than it was with Dr. Price. And I don't think people are fully aware of the devastation to the nutrients in food. And we are Swiss cheese eating Swiss cheese.
I think that makes sense, though. I think we know, and I do think that there's a rise. I was really, it's like we probably came into some of that information around the same time. It's actually funny. I was introduced to Weston A. Price's work around 2009, 2010. And the people I was introduced to it by chose not to use all of their methodology, but it was whole food nutrition. I liked all of that.
Yep.
There was aspects of it that weren't a good fit for me. It was in the muscle testing realm for more specificity. But I've been following along, and I appreciate this. We're now 15 years later, and I might be looking at the world with rose-colored glasses. It might just be my clientele. You're going to have some 50-50. You're going to have people who are like completely dark to everything. And then you've got people who are over here trying to bring back homesteading, especially after the last 5 years, or like nose to tail. I do feel like nose to tail is much more popular. And I do feel like we are hopefully getting away from, I do think we are slowly getting away from over restriction, because even we are Swiss cheese on Swiss cheese is relevant for people on standard American diet and also people who follow health conscious diets that may have some situations where they're just over here supplementing vitamin D and zinc and creating other Swiss cheese situations. I'll call it that.
And people don't realize that the nutrient tables they're so wedded to haven't been updated for decades.
Oh, and I don't think we're going to see that, actually. I don't know when this was. The USDA just quit even supporting the nutrient database in general, which I thought was like, oh, I thought you guys were supposed to be like the gold standard. And you just quit. You just threw in the towel. It's where are we getting this information? And that is a legitimate concern, because a lot of the stuff you talk about is fairly nuanced. And if I just go back to copper for a moment, people would be like, oh, he keeps talking about copper. Where do you get it? Okay, wild animals. When I see rabbit on the menu, I'm ordering it. Rabbit, venison, pork, chlorophyll. We do a lot of chlorophyll in practice because we're always trying to be food-based. Maybe bee pollen.
Organates.
Yeah, organ meats are foundational for us. But when I say those words, shrimp, I guess, as well, when I say those things, first of all, I can understand where copper, I think there's lots of reasons copper gets low, so to be continued on that conversation. But the other piece that worries me, just like you, is like the accuracy of this information on where we get sources of stuff.
It's changed since glyphosate.
And on this note, though, I want you to, because we danced around it a couple of times now, and you brought up grass-fed nutrients but you never fully wrapped that with a bow on the specifics of some of the nutrients. And I actually want you to highlight that because I think the listener cares.
Okay. In terms of the sourcing for the...
You said people don't understand why the nutrients in grass-fed, this was not exactly what you said, were important. And then we got off talking about D and A a little bit more, but I want you to come back to grass-fed nutrition and the differences specifically. And on this note, this was a topic that I looked at literature on probably 15 years ago and struggled to find good literature on at that time. I think your life is a little more devoted to digging for that. So I'm just curious what you share, because what my impression was like, it's a little higher in vitamin A, but actually now 15 years later, 10 to 15 years later, that's probably the most important part.
No, I have a slide that I use in my training. It's a picture of a cow eating grass outside, following the natural order thing. But overlaid on it is the conversion of the grass into milk and the chemical reactions that are involved. And that's what the cow does. That's what the cow brings to the party. It's a chemistry lab, and it can take the beta carotene and the vitamin C that's found naturally in grass. Thank you very much, Mother Nature. And it can use those nutrients to create unprocessed gold. The products that can be produced from raw milk are amazing and many, but it's been demonized in the modern era because so many people are lactose intolerant, not knowing that the lactase enzyme is copper dependent. So that begins to bring it full circle. But the thing is, the nutrients that come up through the root system of the grass and get into the grass are vital to our microbiome as well as the animal's microbiome. And we've become too detached from the source. And that's what the whole Weston A Price movement is all about.
Yeah.
And I think that Dr. Price had lived a little longer, he probably already discovered minerals. I think it would be fascinating to see what he would have to say about minerals. And the key is that he was a big proponent of vitamin A, as you probably know, and really ascribed a lot of benefit to that nutrient. It's funny, back in that day, he was doing most of his work in the 20s and 30s that we know about. But even prior to that, when they were studying vitamin A, like I'm thinking of Hopkins and people that win the Nobel Prizes, they were studying retinol. Dr. Bloch during the First World War, and curing blindness in little boys because they were able to eat butter and cream, and suddenly they got their vision back. But what were they doing to the vitamin D fractions in those studies? They're throwing them away. Back in the 1910s to 1930s, they didn't have any awareness of vitamin D as it's studied today. And we just have to be really careful about, could there be an overemphasis here, but maybe we've lost sight of the balance that these metabolites need to be together. Magnesium and calcium really need to work together. Sodium and potassium need to work together. Iron and copper need to work together. Not copper and zinc. Iron and copper, very different. A and D and E and K. I mean, these are known patterns of pairing that Mother Nature must have had a reason for. And so I think what becomes in favor evolves as time moves forward. And retinol was the rage back in the First World War. Vitamin D is now the rage during the COVID era. And I think we have to take a more balanced view to say, what are the properties of both that we need in order to have proper human physiology? And what's the best sourcing? I think the real issue, I think you're in alignment here, is coming from a bottle may not be the best source.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's where people have been seduced into thinking, oh, I can get it from a bottle and be fine. When I think it's far better to get it from food wherever possible.
Wherever possible. I want to touch on something about Weston A Price and grass-fed protein, and then I want to come back to more about vitamin A because I'm thinking of questions I have about vitamin A that are fun. I want to mention that if you're listening to this, I don't know that we've done much I think people, if they are familiar with Weston A Price, it's because they may have learned some things here or there. I want to just say he was a dentist, and I probably won't do this justice, and maybe you want to comment as well, but I would say that he was a dentist who saw a lot of, I love I love the parallel to me between dentistry and nutrition. I've always felt like the mouth is literally such a gateway to what's going on inside the body. And so I'm not sure if this is what he was seeing, but I know that some of his kind of people that affiliated with him talked about like issues with tooth stuff or structure, or really, I think of the guy who wrote Pottinger's Cats. Basically, it was like he saw an ancient tribe on a different continent that had no exposure to standard American ways, and they had these perfect teeth. And the more you introduced some of the stuff in the deficiencies we had, the teeth continued to get more and more crooked. And so anyway, Weston A prices, I guess it was mostly what we would call it. What was it called? Traditional wisdoms or traditional. It was just nose to tail to me. It's like whole food, and I'm not doing it full justice. I'm ancient traditions. There's maybe the complementary cookbook that went along with all of this. I would say like whole corner of nutrition. He was massively criticized. I will say that as well, because I think it's just good to acknowledge that he was massively criticized. I remember being in college and coming across some of that in my schooling accidentally. He was massively criticized because of his vigor for raw milk and some of that. And of course, the concern with raw milk is related to food safety, right? And so, whatever, just sharing. If you look up Weston A. Price, the internet may tell you he was crazy, but really he was just a dentist that saw the health degrading in people and was really into nose to tail. And I think that a lot of people I find that there's a lot of Weston A. Price tradition in a lot of I was on this podcast called Homegrown Nutrition, and I always call it like the sourdough moms. And it's like a lot of those things there's threads that run through, is my point.
Do you know the backstory about why he did his research?
No, I don't remember that at all.
Yeah. So he's classically trained dentist. He's originally from Canada, ends up in Cleveland, Ohio. And he gives his 12-year-old son a root canal, which that was the standard back then. And his son got an infection and struggled with an infection for 4 years before he died. And Weston A. Price and his wife, Florence, were so devastated by that, he wanted to go out and find perfect teeth. He never wanted to deal with that kind of a loss ever again. And so they traveled the globe for a decade in the summers, looking for indigenous tribes that had perfect teeth. Because what he knew was that when we're a fetus, we have 32 buds that split and become 64 buds. Now, 32 become our teeth. What do the other 32 become?
I'm not sure.
The spine. And what Dr. Price knew was that perfect teeth meant perfect spine, meant perfect health. And you're absolutely right. The oral cavity is a gateway to health. And so I've become involved with the IAOMT, the biological dentists. I've done presentations there. They want me to do the root cause training for their members. And the thing is, Dr. Price and his wife identified 14 tribes that had perfect teeth. And his going-in proposition was, anyone who has perfect teeth is going to be a vegetarian and they're going to have a low-fat diet. That was his going-in proposition. He was wrong on both counts because all of these 14 tribes had animal protein from whale blubber in Alaska down to ants in the Maasai tribesmen in Africa. And upwards of 65% of their calories were from fat. And that's what really shifted his whole paradigm, was to realize how important fat, and especially vitamin A, is. And he also did 2 volumes of research on the dangers of root canals. And then all of that knowledge was put into a trunk, and it was shipped to Hal Huggins. I don't know whether you've ever heard that name. Hal Huggins is another, I guess we would call him a biological dentist, but he never met Dr. Price. But Dr. Price made specific instructions to identify from a dentist who was carrying out the awareness of how dangerous root canals were. And Dr. Huggins gets this chest of information. And that's the mainstay of why there's such a controversy around root canals, is because of the research that Dr. Price did back in the 20s. So he's
100 years ago.
Can
Can you imagine doing that? I always think, then you did a better job telling his story than I did. I just think that's fascinating that he was traveling the world at that time. I think about how that would be somewhat challenging now. And to imagine doing it
Oh
100
my
years
gosh.
ago is next level crazy.
No, it's meant, but he was driven to get truth. And there is a lot of controversy, and he certainly is being branded a crazy man. But
His legacy is really living on 100 years later, though.
oh, it absolutely is. And I think one of the best books I've ever read, hands down, probably the best book ever, was by Ron Schmid, Schmid. He's a naturopath. The Untold Story of Milk. And it's a wonderfully written, beautifully footnoted chronicle of what happened to milk around the world. And it's become demonized, as you certainly know. But the part that people don't know is that milk was really important for the spleen. It nourishes the white pulp of the spleen.
One of the most undervalued organs.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's the hidden organ. But the thing is, spleen is really important. And so you take milk out of the diet and the spleen starts to wobble. And it's a very interesting story about how no one knows anything about the spleen. But it's critical to our immune system, especially autoimmunity. And what's building up in the spleen? Iron. The red pulp of the spleen is where the bulk of the turnover of dying red blood cells is taking place. So it's that we could spend the whole hour just talking about that. But the thing is, what I've really tried to do in this work with the root cause protocol, I know I'm branded a firebrand about iron and vitamin D, but it's because I was trying to be very controversial, trying to wake people up. But we need iron, we need vitamin D. I'm not stupid. It's just in moderation. And people don't understand what that means. And so everyone's looking for the next shiny object, what's new. And then they go after it with a passion, as you've noted. And I think what's really important is balance and perspective and a willingness to modulate the narrative. We've got to calm down and say, what did our ancestors do? How did they eat?
I think that's the best news. I think that's the best news is that we can and will get into some kind of hard to understand parts of information. But when we go back to how we were made and innate wisdom, a lot of the answers solve themselves because nature was already made perfectly. It's just we screwed it up a little bit along the way. Quite a bit, actually.
If you want to have fun, get a copy of Fanny Farmer's cookbook from 200 years ago.
Mm.
You can get them in the library. You can get them, sometimes you can get them online. But look at what was being eaten 200 years ago. You wouldn't recognize half the food, but it was all butter, heavy cream, sausages. It's just the nutrient density of food was completely different.
Something I have been wanting to do that I keep forgetting, but you brought up after this one time frame how they were so fascinating with vitamin A. I've always been wanting to just call up old ladies, and I got a lot of them I could call up. But sometimes I would have clients say, oh, my grandmother used to always give us cod liver oil all winter, which I would just love to know the origins of that. Where I live is very much Germans that moved to Russia or Ukraine and then moved to the Dakotas. And that's a whole, it's like sometimes I know that's part of the history as well. And I think obviously where people are coming from makes a difference, but it's just something I've been curious about is, oh yes, what did your grandmother give you cod liver oil? And I wonder where they got that concept, to be honest.
Oh, I know. One of the most fun conversations I had with a client when we were in Chicago, this woman, she was probably in her early 40s, had beautiful hair, just gorgeous, thick, luscious hair. And I said, how'd you do that? What are you doing?
I know, you're really interested. I'm just joking because Morley's kind of like has half of a head of hair.
He dealt with, oh, what? Where's my hair? But she turned 8 shades of red. And she said, you probably shall never tell anyone. I said, oh, of course. But we did you tell us? And she's Polish. And her grandmother, when she would go over to Poland to visit her grandma, she taught her how to wash her hair with pig lard. Pig lard.
Oh, interesting. I feel like I could try this.
How do you make soap? With lard. I said, that's it? She said, it was really like, it was a wow factor. But the nutrients in that pig lard,
Yeah.
not fat, Guess what it has in vitamin D?
Probably vitamin A, I was thinking.
Well, no, but also vitamin D.
Yeah.
And again, it isn't that D is banned. It's been overplayed. It's out of balance.
It's like part of, yeah, I think, and I want to summarize that a little bit here in a second, but I want to mention something else just in tandem with your comment about your favorite book, The Untold Story of Milk. And maybe this would be nice for you to know. Probably one of the reasons I've arrived, and I think this is just useful in general to share. I, in 2010, was introduced to the work of Weston A because of that muscle testing community. I ultimately was not in love with the muscle testing community, and I'm not saying I totally have a disdain for that. It was how it was being done. It felt endless, like that there wasn't an exit strategy, and it was didn't. I like to understand physiology a little bit, and that wasn't being included. And then I ended up in food sensitivity world around 2015, and so I was really helping people restrict their diets because I'm a dietitian. I did all kinds of nuanced different food sensitivities until I finally got to a point where I was like, this sucks. And also that with nutrient, it was like fun for a while. And then what about the long game? For me, I'm always like, I'm a little bit of also a crazy person. This doesn't seem like the best choice. And so really my work now revolves around how to help people overcome these sensitivities. And I bring this up because I forgot for us to define root cause protocol. And I wanted to share a definition, how I think of it, and maybe you offer a very different definition. And I think this is really cool, big picture. We've got a couple schools of thought in maybe our corner of the world, right? Health, where it's like you can be in germ theory or terrain theory or strengthening the host. And the root cause protocol is really a whole food synergistic kind of a step-by-step piece. And there's really two halves, but it's stop doing things that are depleting nutrients and put like high quality nutrients back. Mostly, yeah, just super food-based and synergistic. And the goal is to strengthen the host, which for all of us should all be the thing. And I will say, it's probably the challenge that we need to consider is that it's a bit lifelong. And I don't mean that in a negative way necessarily, but there's not, yeah, it's not really it's not, you may see some changes initially, and you can for sure. Like when we start people on organ things, I have specific normal timeframes on which people feel a little bit better. But to get everything to shift, it's a step, it's a process, and it does take time. It does take time. And actually, I want to hear about how your health has shifted as you've gone through all of these layers and honestly identities. First magnesium, then copper. It may be hard to summarize. We are summarizing 15 years of, I guess it's about 15 years of stuff.
Yeah. I have more energy now than I had when I was in my 50s. When I was 16, I got glasses. When I turned 40, I had to get bifocals. And then as I got into my 50s, I needed cheaters on top of the bifocals so I could read the stuff on the phone, right? And then I started getting headaches. I'm like, what's Dr. Lewis again. She said, you're overcorrecting your eyes. I said, no, I got to be able to read what's on the internet, blah, blah. She said, you're overcorrecting. She said, take off your glasses. I said, I won't be able to see. She said, take off your glasses. I can read 2.5 without my glasses. So the protocol strengthened my eyes. So I don't need glasses anymore. I haven't used glasses for about 7 or 8 years. And that's very unusual for older people to be able to just put them down and not use them again. I come from a long line of heart attacks. My heart is doing just fine, thank you very much. I don't really have any symptoms other than this goofy hair that seems to be, I call it natural electrolysis. For whatever reason, just it didn't stick. But again, it's just, I don't know. The part that I think is most disruptive about the protocol is it's a one size fits all. And people find that, especially practitioners, find that wildly offensive. But we're all the same inside.
I really don't find it offensive because I told you earlier, you asked me before we hit record, where did you get your training? And I guess you weren't looking for this, but I was like, oh, I learned most of what I know from clients and from mentorship, getting mentorship at the time I wanted. And I just like pattern recognition. And so recently I redid a lot of what I was doing to not require testing. I'll do testing if people want to, but I was really trying to answer better. I think you do this too. I was just trying to answer better questions. I was like, how can we help people faster and easier without getting stuck on something? I was like, I can just get rid of this really expensive test that I don't really need anymore. If I see these patterns, I know that you've got this system wants love. So I would say we really embrace root cause protocol. I don't necessarily teach it quite like that, but it's an opportunity. It's still an opportunity. We always have lots of opportunities of lots of things I'm always trying to implement easier for people, right? But most of the principles, much of those principles are generally there, right? And it's part of that whole strengthening the host. That's a huge part of what we want for everyone long term, but it does take time. It takes
No, I tell people it's going to take you 12
that part.
12 to 18 months to really turn the battleship around. And I said it may happen faster, but this idea that we can get well yesterday, got to stop thinking like that. The body doesn't respond to that kind of generation. And the goal here is that, as I noted earlier, it's a lifestyle program. It's not a diet.
Yeah.
You're going to be taking this the rest of your life, as your ancestors did in their natural daily diet. But we don't have the luxury of having the food that has these nutrients in it.
And I do think the other really positive thing for us, like when people walk in the door, I always say the first step is prioritizing. I want to know, are these some of your symptoms or are these some of your symptoms? Because if you're in a hypersensitive state, I'm going to go in and nourish you first, because if you don't have nutrients, like nothing's going to work. Nothing. I can't really do anything if your immune system is having a freak out because you have nothing in your body, right? So that's always going to be where we start too. So like I said at the beginning, we are aligned. It's just a matter of helping people. When people come in and they're on vitamin D by itself, or zinc by itself, this is really lazy, actually. Let's improve upon this. And so I want to highlight, you can interrupt me if you want. I wanted to just highlight, some of the concepts of what we talked about and maybe that big picture again, which is that vitamin D is essential. So we're not arguing with the potentially hundreds of thousands of papers about the importance of vitamin D. I always say that if we looked at all the papers with all the nutrients, you would find, and you've done some of this, right? If you research any nutrient, you'll be like, this is like the best thing since forever, right? That's how nutrients are. They're all so damn essential. The issue is that we can over supplement and not realize the downstream effects that we are ignoring, namely vitamin A, retinol, which I might have a couple more questions about. Retinol, I just feel like there's probably a lot to talk about with that. And then does magnesium gets degraded, I guess, with vitamin D? Because magnesium is required in 8 places for vitamin D metabolism. So if you're just taking a bunch of vitamin D and you don't have the magnesium, then you would further deplete it. Is that right? And the copper as well, right? Copper is compromised by vitamin D.
It is. It's a very nuanced but
Conversation to be continued, right?
Here's, just to make sure people understand this, what makes copper bioavailable are critical enzymes that are activated by retinol. And when people are focusing all their attention on D, the uptake mechanism in our gut is binary. You can take A or D, but you can't take both. When you're drowning the body with D, you're not going to get the requisite amount of retinol that's needed to fire up the engines of copper enzymes. That's the connection.
Yeah. So as you heard him talk a little bit about copper, and then I talked about food sources of copper, and then we talked about vitamin A, and we talked about namely cod liver oil being the main food source of vitamin A. Grass-fed foods have more vitamin A than non-grass-fed foods. When we're talking about large amounts of vitamin A, though, is there any other food-based sources that we did not take into consideration?
The classic are the grass-fed beef liver, yard eggs, grass-fed butter, grass-fed heavy cream, and then cod liver oil. Those are the big 5.
Cool. And I want to ask you this, and it may just open us up, and I don't know if you have a second, but I just can't help it because this last week with Easter, and I had less sleep, and I had all the ripe things that could allow me to pick up something. I started to have a cold on Sunday morning, and I like to throw lots of things at immunoglobulins, etc. And I like to work with what I have on hand, which I had part of a bottle of vitamin A retinol left. And I took a very large dose of vitamin A retinol. And I want to hear about if you ever use supplemental vitamin A or if you only use food-based vitamin A.
Prefer the food-based. I don't think we really know how the synthetic form is made. And I always worry about human hands touching chemistry.
I think that's reasonable.
Yeah.
I think that's reasonable.
They
I do
have,
think it's
they have the right chemistry, but I'm sure it's very biology.
And on that note, I think also something to consider when we're talking about vitamin A is retinol is used, a synthetic retinol is used a lot in the skincare industry.
So
And you absorb that, and it's contraindicated for pregnancy because it's known as a tetragen. So it's known to create birth defects. And so I think it's important to bring that up, and that's a synthetic retinol form vitamin A. So we would just want to think about that with supplementation in general. I think and also something we can just be aligned on in general as well is like synthetic nutrients are always concerning, right? Synthetic nutrients
Absolutely.
are always concerning because we're not getting that whole construct. And there will
Let's
always be
not-
arguments about that, but
Yeah, but let's balance out the retinol in pregnancy. That breastfeeding is a very viable and very natural way to feed the baby. The bulk of that nutrient is retinol. So I think people need to have a broad view that the form that you're talking about is very different than what's coming through breast milk.
For sure.
The problem we've got is that we live in a society now that thinks that butter and margarine and canola oil are all the same, and they're not.
yeah, hopefully we
almost-
don't actually live in that society anymore. Maybe
Go to the supermarket and show me the butter.
they're next to each other. I
With
do
the butter,
forget.
it's like two sticks, and there's 10,000 forms of spread.
Yeah, I almost ignore. Sometimes you forget like what you've filtered out already. And so I think it's important to share that because I'm like, because we create our own silos sometimes. It's, oh, I forget all of the positive food changes I made over a long time because we forget about
Yeah.
things that we've taken care of.
I'm aware of the filtering that you brought through on your own, which is great. And the people you're working with may not have gone through that process.
I think we can't quite end this without commenting on one other little thing, which I feel that you're etched in my brain for this because people will see maybe a low vitamin D on lab testing, but you always talk about how it is a signal, it's a signpost of inflammation. Vitamin D gets used up in the inflammatory process. And so when you're seeing, earlier today I was talking about when you see low B12, it means you're not digesting animal protein. And when you see
Right.
low vitamin D, it may probably mean that it was dealing with inflammation, or it may mean that possibly.
And again, Meg Mangan does a masterful job of explaining low vitamin D and its relationship to inflammation. The mistake that's made is that people have been, I think, led to believe, maybe unwittingly, but I think they've been led to believe, if I take more vitamin D, I can neutralize my inflammation. You won't do that at all. Vitamin D it's a billboard for inflammation because when you lose magnesium, you're going to get inflammation because magnesium is going to mean, oh, iron is rising. And so iron is driving inflammation. And that's going to have a decided effect on the vitamin D. It's going to be low. It's low, which means, oh, we've got inflammation. But drinking or swallowing capsules of vitamin D is not going to offset the iron magnesium crisis that's causing the situation. That's where I think needs to be clarity to get people to realize that there's more to just taking the supplement.
Yeah, for sure. I actually have one more question. Do you have a second? Okay, cool. I just want to make sure this is clear because I think about when we take vitamin D, we're suppressing vitamin A, but you gave an example of a suppression versus downregulation, and you were saying vitamin D suppresses, it puts a pillow over the head, the immune system, whereas the vitamin A downregulates it, which is singing it a lullaby. So the vitamin A is more, I think I understand it as now I'm talking about it, but when you were talking about it in general, here's why I wanted to highlight it again, because, and this is now, we're just starting this. Jeff Bland has been talking about this. It's like, we're not trying to boost the immune system. We are trying to create homeostasis in the immune system, because that was another COVID oversimplification misnomer, is let's boost the immune system. And it's like, yeah, we're actually just trying to get it to be like homeostatic, actually. And I think that's what you're saying in this as well, is it's, oh yes, when you take vitamin A, or when you're taking cod liver oil with vitamin A, it's not that you're trying to boost the immune system, it's that you're supporting it into, I guess, homeostasis if it's overacting or something like that.
I think what we're really seeking to do within the root cause protocol is energize the body, because the immune system requires energy. You don't think about, they think that the immune system, oh, it's in the gut, it's got this thing going and I don't have to worry about it. It's got to have energy. If it doesn't have energy, you can't think. And so that's why it's cure your fatigue. It's a play.
Which is real cutesy, by the way. Good job on that. I liked it. I thought it was good. It was a compliment.
No, I appreciate that. But it's based on the work of Douglas Wallace at Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, who focuses on cellular energy deficiency. That's the clinical term for fatigue. And what's the number one reason you don't see a doctor? I'm tired.
I know, this is a huge area of interest for me, actually. Like, probably why I like your work also. I just think that we have way too many opportunities to improve energy. And generally, I'm very just aligned with what you're saying also. But I think that it's a real sorrow for us to accept that getting tired is acceptable for us.
Yeah, that's right. The body needs to, when we have stress, we need to have resilience. What does that mean? It means we need to produce energy to respond to that stress.
Yeah, I love that
We want
definition.
to have that capacity to do that. And that's what's missing in society.
Yeah, I love that. Resilience is the energy to respond to the stress. Yeah. Cool. Love it. Love it. That's it. That has been a concept I have been noodling with for a long time. It's just resilience. Something I love that. And I wanted to share that I was able to pull up Megan Mangan's article. It looks like it's called Inflammation and Vitamin D, the Infection Connection is what I think it is. Right.
It's a blockbuster. I think it's one of the most important articles I've read.
Published in Inflammation Research in 2014. And she's an RN.
An RN.
That's super cool. That's actually pretty, I love that. And it looks like that's really cool. So I love it. And there's lots of
very well footnoted.
Yeah.
The citations are
very cool. Morley, is there anything that you want to? I think we did a pretty okay job today sticking to vitamin D, but then touching on those other important components and making sure that people know that vitamin D is necessary, but we have been going about it incorrectly and without considering the downstream effects of what we're causing. So is there anything that you want to wrap up with, or where can people find you online?
We're on all the social media platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, what have you. But just look up Root Cause Protocol. Website, rcp123.org. People invariably want to reach out to me personally. That's fine. We're very happy to do that. My email is my first and last name, Morley Robbins @gmail. And for the brave few, my phone number is area code 847-922-8061. I get calls all the time, and that's okay. I want to answer people's questions. I want to make sure people understand this and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for coming on today. So on deck is copper, but I got to come ready to play. Okay?
Exactly.
All right, cool. Thanks so much. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bones, but they just keep breaking.